The air in Calcutta hung heavy with the weight of monsoon clouds that refused to break. February 1992. The streets pulsed with life, rickshaws weaving through crowds, the distant call of street vendors, the perpetual symphony of a city that never truly slept. But on this particular morning, something had shifted in the atmosphere. Word had spread through the narrow alleyways and crowded markets like wildfire. She was coming. The princess, Diana. In a city where Mother Teresa had become synonymous with divine compassion, where suffering and salvation walked hand in hand through every corridor, the arrival of British royalty carried a different kind of electricity. The colonial past still whispered through Calcutta's architecture. Grand buildings that had once housed the machinery of empire now weathered and worn, their facades telling stories of transition, of independence, of a nation that had reclaimed its soul. And now a princess was returning, not as a symbol of that old empire, but perhaps as something else entirely. The morning light filtered through the haze, casting everything in shades of amber and gray, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The Mother Teresa's home for the sick and dying stood quiet, waiting. Inside those walls, humanity in its most vulnerable state sought comfort, sought dignity in the final chapters of life. Outside, preparations were being made. Security details, protocol officers, cameras. The machinery of a royal visit, with all its carefully choreographed precision, was being assembled. But no one, not the officials, not the press, not even Diana herself, could have anticipated what was about to unfold in those sacred halls. What was about to happen would ripple across continents, challenge centuries of tradition, and remind the world that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with a single, simple gesture of love. By 1992, Princess Diana had become something the British monarchy had never quite seen before, a paradox wrapped in designer clothing and genuine tears. 11 years into a marriage that the world had watched with fairy tale fascination, the cracks were now impossible to ignore. The palace attempted to maintain the illusion, but Diana herself was undergoing a transformation that would define not just her life, but the very nature of modern royalty. She was no longer content to simply wave from balconies or cut ribbons at ceremonial openings. Something deeper was calling her, pulling her toward the margins of society, toward the forgotten, the forsaken, the ones polite society preferred to keep at arm's length. Her work with AIDS patients had already shocked the establishment. In a time when fear and ignorance surrounded the disease, when patients were isolated and stigmatized, Diana had done the unthinkable. She touched them. Without gloves, she held their hands, sat on their beds, looked into their eyes with genuine compassion that the cameras couldn't manufacture and the palace couldn't script. It was revolutionary. It was dangerous, they said. It was Diana simply being human. The world in 1992 stood at a crossroads. The Cold War had ended, but new conflicts were emerging. The European Union was taking shape. Technology was beginning to shrink the globe, making distant suffering visible in living rooms across the developed world. And in this shifting landscape, Diana had found her purpose. She was using her platform, that strange, enormous spotlight that came with marrying into the House of Windsor, to shine light into the darkest corners, to places where most royals feared to tread. India had always held a special fascination for the British public, a complicated relationship built on centuries of colonial rule, independence struggles, and cultural exchange. For Diana, this wasn't her first visit to the subcontinent, but it would prove to be the most significant. The official itinerary was carefully planned, as royal tours always were. Meetings with dignitaries, cultural presentations, photo opportunities at historical sites. But Diana had made a request that had caused consternation among the planners. She wanted to visit Mother Teresa's mission. She wanted to spend time, not just minutes, with the patients there. She wanted to go beyond the sanitized, safe encounters that typically characterized royal engagements. The palace advisors were nervous. India's press could be unpredictable. The conditions at the hospice were challenging. There were health concerns, they argued. There were questions of propriety. How would it look? What would the photographs show? The British public, they worried, might not understand. But Diana had learned something in her years of captivity within royal protocol. Sometimes the most important thing you could do was exactly what they told you not to do. Mother Teresa herself was elderly now, her body frail but her spirit as fierce as ever. She had spent decades serving the poorest of the poor in Calcutta, seeing Christ in every suffering face, offering dignity to those the world had discarded. When she learned that Princess Diana wanted to visit, wanted to truly engage with the work being done in her mission, the tiny nun smiled. She recognized something in this young woman, this princess in pearls and pain. She recognized a kindred spirit, another soul who understood that real love required getting your hands dirty, that compassion wasn't something you could delegate or perform from a distance. The morning of the visit, the staff at Mother Teresa's home prepared as best they could. They cleaned the already spotless floors. They arranged the beds with extra care. The patients, many in the final stages of terminal illnesses, many abandoned by their families, society's forgotten ones, were told a special guest was coming. Some understood, some were too weak to care. All of them, whether they knew it or not, were about to become part of a moment that would transcend that room, that city, that day. The motorcade arrived with all the pomp that accompanied royal movements. Security personnel fanned out, checking perimeters, securing positions. The press pool jostled for position, cameras ready, sensing that this might be more than just another photo opportunity. Diana emerged from the car, and even from a distance you could see something different in her demeanor. She wasn't wearing the mask she so often donned for official engagements. That careful smile, that practiced wave. Today there was a softness to her face, a vulnerability in her eyes that the telephoto lenses would capture and broadcast around the world. Mother Teresa greeted her at the entrance, this giant of compassion no taller than Diana's shoulder, dressed in her simple white sari with blue trim. The two women embraced, not with the stiffness of diplomatic protocol, but with genuine warmth. They spoke quietly for a moment, and those who were close enough to observe noted the way Diana listened, really listened, to the elderly nun's words. This wasn't performative. This wasn't for the cameras. This was one soul recognizing another. As they moved inside, the atmosphere changed. The sounds of the city faded, replaced by the quiet rustle of caregivers moving between beds, the soft moans of patients in pain, the whispered prayers of volunteers. The air smelled of antiseptic and incense, of bodies failing and spirits persevering. This was not a place for the squeamish, not a place where you could maintain comfortable distance. This was raw humanity, suffering and service intertwined in the most profound way. The protocol officers who had accompanied Diana felt their anxiety rising. How long should she stay in each area? Should she wear gloves? How close should she get to the patients? They had briefings, guidelines, carefully constructed parameters designed to protect the princess. From disease, from uncomfortable. Move through the wards! They realized with growing alarm that she had no intention of following any of those rules. The first bed held a man, his body wasted by disease, his eyes dim with approaching death. Diana approached without hesitation. She sat down on the edge of his bed, sat directly on it, something protocol would never allow, and took his hand in hers. Not a quick symbolic touch for the cameras. She held his hand, really held it, and looked into his face. She spoke to him softly, words the cameras couldn't hear, words meant only for him. The man's eyes widened, confused perhaps, unable to fully comprehend that a princess, a member of the British royal family, was sitting on his deathbed, treating him not as an untouchable, not as a photo opportunity, but as a human being worthy of dignity and love. The Indian journalists in the room felt their throats tighten. They had covered countless official visits, seen politicians and dignitaries parade through such places for the obligatory compassion photo. But this was different. They could see it in Diana's body language, in the way she wasn't performing for the cameras but seemed almost unaware of them. One photographer, a veteran who had documented Mother Teresa's work for years, would later say that in that moment he saw two things simultaneously: the breaking of centuries of royal protocol and the purest expression of human kindness he had ever witnessed through his lens. The protocol officers exchanged glances. Should they intervene? Should they gently remind the princess of the schedule, of the health precautions, of the image being created? But something stopped them. Perhaps it was the look on Diana's face, a serenity they had rarely seen in the anxious, troubled woman they had come to know. Perhaps it was the realization that they were witnessing something historic, something that transcended their carefully crafted itineraries and risk assessments. Or perhaps deep down, they knew that any attempt to pull her away would be futile. Diana had found what she came for, and nothing was going to rush her through it. She moved to another bed and another, each time the same radical intimacy. She touched foreheads burning with fever. She held hands twisted with disease. She wiped tears from faces marked by suffering. At one point, she encountered a young woman, barely more than a girl, dying of complications from childbirth. The girl had been abandoned by her family, left to die alone in a city that had forgotten her name. Diana sat with her for long minutes, stroking her hair, whispering comfort in a language the girl might not have fully understood, but in a tone that transcended words. Love, it turns out, is the most universal language of all. The volunteers and staff who worked in the home watched in amazement. They had seen countless visitors come through these doors: politicians, celebrities, wealthy donors eager to be associated with Mother Teresa's saintly work. But most maintained a careful distance, a protective barrier between themselves and the suffering they claimed to care about. Diana had demolished that barrier completely. She was kneeling on the floor now, at the bedside of an elderly man whose body was covered in lesions, whose condition made him an outcast even among the outcast. She was speaking to him gently, her hand on his shoulder, treating him with the same dignity she would afford anyone, regardless of their station or condition. Mother Teresa stood in the doorway observing. Her weathered face, carved with the lines of decades spent in service to the suffering, showed something that might have been satisfaction, or perhaps recognition. She had always said that she saw Christ in the distressing disguise of the poor. In that moment, watching this princess minister to the dying with such tender care, she witnessed something equally profound: Christ in the distressing disguise of royalty, breaking free from gilded chains to touch the untouchable. The defining moment came when Diana encountered a patient the staff had been worried about her seeing. A man in the final stages of leprosy, his body ravaged by the disease, his face disfigured, his hands mere stumps. Leprosy carried stigma that transcended cultures, the biblical connotations, the ancient fears, the deep-seated revulsion that even modern medicine hadn't fully erased. The protocol officers stepped forward, ready to guide Diana past, to spare her the discomfort, to protect the pristine image of royal dignity. But Diana saw him. Their eyes met across the room, and in that exchange, something passed between them, a recognition of shared humanity that needed no words, no translation, no mediation by handlers or protocol officers. She walked toward him, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The cameras stopped clicking. The whispered conversations ceased. Even the sounds of suffering seemed to pause. Time itself appeared to slow down, as if the universe was making space for something sacred. Diana knelt beside his bed. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and took what remained of his hands in hers. She held them gently, reverently, as if they were precious. She looked into his disfigured face and smiled, not with pity, not with the strained politeness of duty, but with genuine warmth, with recognition, with love. She spoke to him, her voice soft but clear enough for those nearby to hear the tenderness in it. She stayed with him, not for seconds but for minutes that felt like hours, holding his hands, seeing past the disease to the man beneath, past the stigma to the soul. The man began to weep. Silent tears rolled down his scarred face, tears that spoke of a lifetime of rejection, of being cast out, of being treated as less than human, and now, in this impossible moment, of being seen, truly seen, by someone the world considered royalty. But more than that, being touched, being held, being loved. The volunteers who had cared for him for months had never seen him cry before. He had been stoic in his suffering, resigned to his fate, accepting of his isolation. But Diana's touch had broken something open in him, had reminded him that he was still human, still worthy of compassion, still deserving of dignity. Mother Teresa moved closer now, her eyes glistening with tears of her own. She placed her small, weathered hand on Diana's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, of recognition, of passing something sacred from one generation to another. In that room, in that moment, two women from completely different worlds stood united in the radical act of loving the unlovable, touching the untouchable, seeing Christ in the most distressing disguise of all. The photographs taken in those moments would circle the globe within hours. They would appear on front pages from London to New York, from Tokyo to Sydney. But no photograph, no matter how skillfully captured, could fully convey what happened in that room. The images showed a princess kneeling beside patients, holding hands, offering comfort. What they couldn't show was the shattering of invisible walls, the dismantling of centuries of protocol that had kept royalty separate and elevated above the common suffering of humanity. What they couldn't capture was the revolution contained in that simple act of love. Back at the palace in London, officials watched the news coverage with mixed emotions. On one hand, the images were powerful, humanizing, exactly the kind of positive press that could rehabilitate the monarchy's image in an increasingly skeptical age. On the other hand, they represented something dangerous, a princess who refused to be controlled, who followed her own moral compass regardless of tradition or protocol. Where would it end? What other rules would she break? What other carefully constructed barriers would she tear down? But the people, ordinary people around the world, saw something different in those images. They saw themselves, or rather they saw who they hoped they could be. In an age of growing cynicism, where celebrity compassion often felt manufactured and political empathy seemed calculated for polls, Diana's actions in Calcutta felt real. They saw a woman using her privilege not to elevate herself further, but to descend into the suffering of others, to offer not charity from a distance, but solidarity in the midst of pain. The patients at Mother Teresa's home would talk about that day for the rest of their lives, however long or short those lives might be. The man with leprosy in particular became something of a legend within those walls. He had been touched by a princess, they said. Not just touched, held, loved, seen. His final weeks were marked by a peace that staff had never witnessed in him before. He died knowing that he mattered, that his life had value, that in the eyes of at least one person who could have chosen to pass him by, he was worth stopping for. The ripple effects of that visit extended far beyond one hospice in Calcutta. Diana's actions forced conversations about leprosy, about how we treat society's most vulnerable, about the stigma attached to disease and poverty. Organizations working with leprosy patients reported increased interest, increased funding, increased willingness from volunteers to engage directly with patients. The disease hadn't changed. The patients hadn't changed. But something in the collective consciousness had shifted. If a princess could touch them without fear, could see their humanity without flinching, then perhaps the rest of us could too. The visit to Calcutta marked a turning point in Diana's own journey as well. She had already been involved in humanitarian work, but something crystallized for her in Mother Teresa's mission. She saw with absolute clarity that this was her purpose, her calling, the reason she had been given such an enormous platform. Not to wear tiaras and attend state dinners, though she would continue to do those things, but to use her fame, her access, her influence to shine light on the forgotten and forsaken. In the months and years that followed, Diana would become increasingly bold in her humanitarian work. She would walk through minefields in Angola to draw attention to the devastation of landmines. She would auction her dresses to raise money for AIDS and cancer charities. She would visit war-torn Bosnia and hold traumatized children. She would challenge governments, question policies, and use her every public appearance to advocate for those who had no voice. And it all traced back to moments like Calcutta, to the realization that real power wasn't about maintaining distance and dignity. It was about closing the gap, getting close enough to hold someone's hand, to look into their eyes, to say with your presence, "You matter. You are seen, you are loved." The British monarchy, for its part, was forced to evolve. Diana had shown them something they couldn't unsee, that in an age of mass media and global interconnection, the old model of distant formal royalty was dying. The public needed something more human, more accessible, more real. Future generations of royals would follow Diana's example, engaging in humanitarian work, showing emotion in public, breaking protocol when compassion demanded it. She had quite literally changed the face of monarchy. But beyond the institutional changes, beyond the evolution of royal protocol and the modernization of the House of Windsor, Diana's actions in Calcutta spoke to something more fundamental about what it means to be human. In a world that constantly seeks to divide us, by class, by nationality, by health status, by worthiness, she demonstrated that the most profound act of rebellion is to refuse those divisions, to see in every face, regardless of its condition or circumstance, the reflection of our shared humanity. Philosophers and theologians would write about that moment, about what it means to break protocol in service of love, about the courage required to touch what society deems untouchable, about the radical nature of genuine compassion. Some would invoke the Christian tradition Diana was born into, noting the echoes of Christ's ministry to lepers, his willingness to touch and heal those society had cast out. Others would point to universal principles of human dignity that transcend any single religious tradition. But all agreed on this: what Diana did in Calcutta wasn't just kind, it was revolutionary. Because here's what her actions revealed: the protocols, the rules, the carefully maintained distances between royalty and commoner, between wealthy and poor, between healthy and sick, they were all constructs, all artificial barriers that we could choose to maintain or choose to dismantle. Diana chose to dismantle them. Not with speeches or manifestos, not with political activism or protest, but with simple, direct human contact. She touched them, she held them, she stayed with them. And in doing so, she showed that the emperor, or in this case the empress, had no clothes. The mystique of royalty, the elevation above common humanity, was revealed as an illusion that could be shattered by anyone brave enough to simply extend their hand in love. The world has changed dramatically in the decades since Diana knelt beside that bed in Calcutta. Mother Teresa has passed away, canonized by the Catholic Church. The mission she founded continues its work, serving the poorest of the poor, offering dignity to the dying. And Diana herself has been gone for many years now, her life cut short in that terrible accident in Paris. But the moment in Calcutta remains, frozen in photographs, embedded in memory, standing as a testament to what one person can do when they choose compassion over convention, humanity over protocol, love over fear. Young people today who weren't even born when Diana died still know her story, still see her as an icon of compassion and courage. They share those photographs from Calcutta on social media, accompanied by captions about empathy and human dignity. They hold her up as an example of using privilege for good, of leveraging fame for justice, of refusing to let status insulate you from the suffering of others. The specifics of royal protocol mean little to them, but the principle behind Diana's actions resonates across generations. Be brave enough to care, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it breaks the rules, even when others tell you to maintain your distance. In hospitals and hospices around the world, caregivers continue the work that Diana brought such powerful attention to. They touch patients that others fear. They hold hands that others would rather not acknowledge. They see humanity in faces that society finds it convenient to look away from. And many of them cite Diana as an inspiration, as proof that compassion isn't about grand gestures or elaborate programs. It's about being willing to get close, to make contact, to stay present with suffering rather than turning away. The man with leprosy whose hands Diana held has been gone for many years. But his moment with her, that brief encounter that lasted only minutes but resonated for eternity, stands as a symbol of something profoundly important. That every life has dignity, that every person deserves to be seen, that no one is untouchable when we approach them with love. He died knowing he mattered. In a world where so many people die feeling forgotten, invisible, disposable, that's no small thing. Diana gave him that gift, that recognition, that final affirmation of his worth. As we look back on that February day in Calcutta in 1992, we're invited to consider our own moments of choice. When do we maintain our distance, and when do we close the gap? When do we follow protocol at the expense of human connection? When do we let fear or propriety or concern about appearances keep us from truly seeing and touching and loving the people around us who most need it? Diana's example challenges us to be braver, more compassionate, more willing to break the rules when love demands it. There's a line from Mother Teresa that Diana once quoted in an interview. "Not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love." Diana understood that. She understood that revolution doesn't always require manifestos and movements. Sometimes it just requires being willing to sit on the edge of a bed, to take a suffering person's hand in yours, to look at them with eyes that say, "I see you, you matter, you are not alone." The world continues to struggle with the same issues Diana confronted in that hospice. We still stigmatize disease. We still marginalize the poor. We still construct elaborate barriers between the comfortable and the suffering. We still have untouchables in our societies, people we'd rather not acknowledge, problems we'd prefer to keep at arm's length. But Diana showed us it doesn't have to be that way. The barriers only exist if we consent to maintaining them. We can choose differently. We can choose to touch, to connect, to love. Her legacy isn't in the institutions she founded or the policies she changed, though those exist. Her legacy is in the countless individual acts of compassion her example inspired. The nurse who holds the hand of a dying patient even when it's not required. The volunteer who doesn't flinch away from disfigurement. The stranger who stops to truly see another human being in distress. Every time someone chooses compassion over comfort, connection over protocol, love over fear, Diana's spirit lives on. In the end, what happened in Calcutta in 1992 was both extraordinary and utterly simple. A woman saw people suffering and she responded with love. She didn't let her title or her status or the expectations placed upon her prevent her from doing what her heart knew was right. She touched them. She held them. She saw them. And in doing so, she reminded all of us what it means to be truly royal. Not in the sense of crowns and thrones, but in the sense of embodying the highest virtues of which humans are capable. Courage, compassion, love. The photographs from that day remain as powerful now as they were then. Diana kneeling beside those beds, holding those hands, seeing those faces. Her expression is peaceful, present, alive in a way she rarely appeared in formal royal settings. She had found her purpose, her calling, her way of being in the world. And for the patients she touched, for the staff who witnessed it, for the millions who saw the images and felt something shift inside them, that moment became sacred ground. A reminder that in a world that so often chooses division and distance, we can always choose differently. We can choose to close the gap. We can choose to extend our hand. We can choose, as Diana did, to love. The sun set over Calcutta that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the crowded streets. Inside Mother Teresa's home, the patients settled into their beds. Volunteers continued their tireless work, and the rhythms of suffering and service continued as they had for decades. But something had shifted. A princess had come, not to be served but to serve, not to be elevated but to descend, not to maintain distance but to close it completely. And in the wake of her visit, a single truth resonated through those walls and out into the world beyond. Love, real love, is always willing to break the rules. It's always willing to risk. It's always willing to touch what others call untouchable and see what others overlook. Diana knew that. She lived it. And in doing so, she touched not just the hands of the dying in Calcutta, but the hearts of countless millions around the world who watched and wondered if they, too, might find the courage to love so fearlessly. That is her legacy. That is her gift to us. Not the fairy tale wedding or the designer wardrobe or even the troubled marriage that captivated the tabloids. Her gift is the reminder that we are all capable of extraordinary compassion, that we all have the power to break protocol when love demands it, that we can all choose to see and touch and love the ones our society would prefer we ignore. Diana stood up to royal protocol in Calcutta. But more than that, she stood up for human dignity, for the worth of every person, for the revolutionary power of a simple, loving touch. What she did next didn't just touch the world. It changed it, one held hand at a time.